The sky was covered in a thick layer of clouds, the kind that did not promise rain or sunlight, but only more of themselves. The sea below them moved slowly, as if reluctant to go anywhere in particular. The air was neither cold nor warm, though it leaned slightly toward chill. An old man named Edmund walked along the shore. The walking might be too strong a word. It was more of a steady movement, a slow continuation of one foot after the other. He had begun the walk earlier that morning, or perhaps a bit later, but the exact time didn't matter, and he had not checked. The tide was halfway in, or halfway out. It was difficult to tell which, and Edmund didn't feel a need to decide. He wore a coat that had seen many years. It was greyish-brown, though it might once have been just brown. The hem brushed faintly against his boots with each step. The boots were old as well, made of a leather that had long since stopped shining. When he stepped, they made small, uneven impressions in the wet sand, which filled slowly as water seeped back in. The beach stretched ahead for a long distance, though not so far that it could be called endless. Edmund looked down more often than ahead, watching the slow shuffle of his own steps. Occasionally he looked toward the water, not expecting to see much. The waves rolled in at their own pace, small and unremarkable. They made a sound that was not loud, but not quiet either. A kind of continuous sigh that had gone on for so long. It seemed strange to notice it at all. He passed a piece of driftwood. It was not particularly large. He considered picking it up, but then he did not. After a few steps, he turned slightly to look back at it, just to make sure it was still there. It was. Further along, there was a patch of darker sand, where the water had receded unevenly. Edmund stepped around it, not because it mattered, but because he had already started to do so. A small gust of wind moved across the beach, shifting his coat a little. He thought it might rain, though it did not. He looked up at the sky again. It had not changed. The clouds remained, slow and unmoving. There was no visible sun, yet the light remained constant. He thought briefly that the world had looked much the same the day before, and perhaps the day before that too. After some time he stopped and stood still. The sea moved, and he did not. He listened, though there was not much to listen to beyond the waves and the faint rustle of his coat. He could hear his own breathing, steady but not deep. He rubbed his hands together once, though they were not cold enough to require it. He began walking again, at nearly the same pace as before. His boots made soft sounds on the sand, then faint crunches when he reached a section with more shells. The shells were small, mostly broken. He noticed one that was nearly whole, bent to look at it, then straightened without picking it up. The coastline curved slightly to the right. He followed it without thinking. The dunes rose a little higher there, with tufts of grass growing in uneven patches. He looked at them for a while, then stopped looking. There was a piece of rope tangled near the water's edge. It looked like it had been there some time. He stood near it for several moments, neither close enough to touch, nor far enough to ignore. Then he moved on. He thought without much interest about how long the walk might take. It wasn't a goal-oriented walk. He had nowhere to be, and nothing waiting for him when he returned. He only wanted to keep moving until he decided to stop, which would likely be when he grew tired, or when the light began to fade, whichever happened first. A group of seagulls stood further down the beach, unmoving. When he approached, two of them lifted briefly into the air and then landed again not far away. Their calls were short and plain. He watched them for a moment and then walked past. The clouds thickened, though not dramatically. The light grew dimmer, but only slightly. Edmund could feel a faint dampness on his face. Not quite mist, not quite drizzle. It didn't bother him. His hat caught most of it. He adjusted the brim once, then left it alone. As he continued, he found a section of the beach where the sand was smoother and lighter in colour. His footprints stayed clear for a while before the wind softened their edges. He looked back at the line they made, stretching behind him in a straight, deliberate path. Then he turned forward again. After perhaps an hour, or less, or more, he stopped near a shallow pool of seawater, left behind by the tide. It reflected the grey sky above, though the reflection wasn't clear. He looked down at it, saw his own face faintly, though the ripples distorted it. He stayed like that for a long moment, not thinking of anything in particular. He bent down slowly, picked up a small pebble, and dropped it into the pool. The ripples spread, then disappeared. He waited until the surface was still again, then straightened and continued walking. The shore grew narrower in places, where the dunes pressed closer to the water. The sand there was firmer, mixed with small stones. He stepped carefully, though there was little need to. A faint sound of the wind brushing the grass came from the dunes. It was not unpleasant, but not especially interesting either. At one point he noticed a fragment of the wooden crate, half buried in sand. It had some faint writing on it. The most of the letters were gone. He squinted at it for a while, but couldn't make out what it had once said. He gave a small nod, as though acknowledging the fact. Malt on. He thought perhaps he might sit down for a while. He looked for a suitable rock or piece of driftwood, but didn't find one nearby. So he kept walking, deciding that sitting could wait. The day wore on in its own slow way. The clouds shifted only slightly, never breaking. The air felt heavier, but not unpleasantly so. The sound of the waves stayed the same, repetitive, constant, and somehow easy to ignore after a while. Eventually, Edmund came to a part of the beach where the sand rose more sharply toward the dunes. He stopped there, partly because he felt he might as well. He looked out at the sea once more. It was the same sea he had been looking at all morning. The waves came in and went out and came in again. He stood with his hands behind his back. A few moments passed, or perhaps more than a few. Then he turned around and began to walk back the way he had come. His footprints were still faintly visible in places, though some had already been erased by the tide. He followed them for a while, not because he needed to, but because they were there. As he walked, he thought about how the clouds had not moved much. He tried to recall the last time he had seen the beach under clear skies, but he could not remember. Perhaps it had been many months ago, or perhaps last week. It made little difference. The walk back was much like the walk forward, though slightly slower. The air had cooled a little, and the sound of the waves seemed softer, though that might have been his imagination. He passed the same driftwood he had seen earlier. It looked exactly the same. He looked at it again, then moved on. By the time he reached the place where he had started, the light had changed only slightly. He stopped, looking out over the water one final time. The sea continued its slow movement, as if it would go on doing so forever. Edmund took a breath, then another. He looked down at his boots. saw the wet sand clinging to them and brushed it off against a small stone. He adjusted his coat. Then he began the short walk back toward the small path that led up from the beach. He did not hurry. There was no reason to. The sound of the waves followed him for a while, then faded as he moved away. The wind lessened behind the dunes. He walked until the sand became grass, then dirt, then the uneven stones of the path. When he reached the top of the hill, he turned once more to look back. The beach stretched below, gray and quiet. The sea kept moving. The clouds stayed in place. Nothing much had changed. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned away and began the slow walk home. The wind stirred once, then settled again. The day went on, as days tend to do.